We're in Skerries in North County Dublin today because this week's episode of On the Shelf is with an author who lives here, who grew up here, who continues to work here and who set his first few books here. The former arts journalist broke onto the literary scene a few years ago with a children's fantasy series called Darkmouth. It proved very popular internationally. He's now moved on to a new character called Boot, a toy robot who finds himself on a scrap heap and isn't quite sure how he got there. We're going to go and have a look around his office, see where he works and see what 5 books have meant something to him. Hegarty's office, and yeah, this is where you write.
This is where I write with the green. This is the most sickly green that's ever been found. I think there's just one distinct shade of green that they've saved for this office.
Did you paint it, or
no?
Was this it? No, this is
no. My landlord painted it before I came in, and for 6 years I've said I'm going to give it a nice spruce up. Have I done it? No.
But you're busy writing. Did you start writing here as opposed to at home from the beginning when you started writing Darkmouth, or when did you come here?
No. When I started writing Darkmouth, I started writing it on the train.
Right. Okay.
Because I was working in the Irish Times, so I was literally in and out on the train every day, sitting in the corridor on the floor, and then I started to expand it into my lunch breaks and my evenings. And then occasionally, if I was in early, I'd run up to the Irish Times canteen and kind of write stuff out.
Yeah.
And then my wife, Maeve, who was fantastic, once she realised there was a chance we might actually get published, once we knew that there was, she'd give it a go, we had twins, newborn twins, and we had 2 other children, our own, I should say, not somebody else's. And I had 2 weeks holidays, and she said to me, go into the library, National Library in Dublin, pretend like you're working, but just go in and write. And that's where I sort of broke the back of it then. And that, so even though she kind of needed me at home, she said, no, go and do this, because she knew there's something I'd always wanted to do.
Yeah.
And then once that was sort of the moment after that, then everything kind of came together, and I was lucky enough to sort of be able to finish up in the Irish Times and come here to this lovely snot green room.
Do you come to the snot green room like relatively like a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 thing?
Yeah, literally, I'd say almost literally a 9 to 5.
Okay.
So I work, now I do sometimes work at home, because in the summer, this room gets hotter than the surface of the sun.
Yeah.
There's a skylight up here that just the sun comes right through. So sometimes I'll work from home, but generally I work a 9 to 5 in here like I have a proper job. Okay. That's what I try and pretend.
Okay, so your 5 books are here. So I guess if we start with Roald, the Twits, a classic.
Yeah, and it is. And I could have picked so many children's books from the very beginning. I mean, my first kind of proper chapter book was Winnie the Pooh, and I remember reading 30 pages in the first night and being just, this is it, this is, I love books.
Were you reading it yourself, or was it being read
myself? It was the first one that I kind of just grabbed, whatever age I was, probably about 6 or 7. And then the 3, there were things like Alfred Hitchhiker and the 3 Investigators, which was this detective series set in San Francisco or California, wherever. But Roald Dahl was really the moment that, I suppose, a combination of things. I remember the Twits, a really good friend of mine had the Twits, and he was just telling me about all this great stuff in it, and I picked it up, and like so many kids since, just found everything about this story utterly hilarious, and it felt and read so different to Enid Blyton or Winnie the Pooh or the things that I had been reading.
Yeah.
And it was disgusting, and the adults in it were horrible, and the scenarios they ended up in were horrible, and there's so many classic things in this, the worm spaghetti, the shrinks, all those. And then, as I read all the Roald Dahls, and I turned on the TV one day, and there was Roald Dahl on the TV, and he was walking to his writing shed.
Yes.
And that was the first time, because now kids see writers all the time. We're sort of everywhere. You can't kind of get rid of us. We keep turning up in schools and libraries, and David Walliams is on TV every week, and so many celebrities now are writing children's books. Some of them are writing them, some of them are getting help. But they're generally, you know, producing children's books. But Roald Dahl was the first person I ever saw that was a children's writer, and that I went, that's a job. That's something you can actually do. And that was kind of a moment where I went, oh, I'd like to do that.
Yeah.
That's something I'd like to do. You can actually do it. I'd like to have a writing shed.
But
I'd like to wander off and do that during the day.
Did you actually want to do, because you, like you said, you worked for the Irish Times, you were a journalist for a while, but did you actually want to write books or have the idea from such a young age?
Yeah, it's the only thing I've ever wanted to do.
Okay.
And I genuinely remember, and I talk to kids about this when I go to schools, I was in first class and we were asked to write a poem, and I put, we put the poem up on the wall, and I just remember writing that poem and putting it up with all the other poems on the wall and thinking, I quite like doing that. You know, I really enjoy that. I think that's quite good. It probably wasn't quite good, but I remember, and from then, that's all I ever wanted to do. So I grew up reading everything. And, you know, my mum and dad only live across the road here. I mean, I literally grew up 3 doors away from where we are here now. They just kind of kept me fed in books, and then I'd go to my granny's and I'd read the old Reader's Digests, and I have the National Geographics, a couple of old ones here, and I just, I'd read all that, and then I'd read whatever came my way. I'd read my sister's books, and all that time I knew that that's what I wanted to do. But
you talked about how your wife sort of gave you that push to finish it when you started writing Darkmouth originally, but what made you start? Can you remember when you finally said, okay, now's the time, I'm actually going to write a book?
Yeah, because
well, you had written books before.
I had, and that's the thing. I'd written a couple of books. I'd written a couple of history books.
Yeah.
One of them on 1916, and then another sort of bigger sort of history of Ireland. But they were, and I really enjoyed doing them. I mean, the 1916 book was written with Fintan O'Toole, and it was done for an Irish Times project. And then I kind of realised when we had the twins coming along, I'd always wanted to write a story of fantasy and adventure and excitement and all these things, and I really liked science fiction, and but I probably, like a lot of people, thought that I just don't know where I'd start. I don't have the imagination for it. I think it's quite easy to tell yourself what you can't do, and I was looking for another project to do, another book to write. And then once we realised there were twins coming along, I realised it wasn't going to be a history book that required lots of research and time spent in libraries and all of that kind of thing, that it was going to have, that it forced me to do the one thing that I always wanted to do, but wasn't sure that I could really do. Yeah. So I just sort of made a determination that I was going to give it a go. I was going to look for an idea. I didn't really know what I was writing for or who I was writing for, which I don't think is a bad place to start. I think it's good to just, the idea is the first thing. And once I kind of had that moment on the train where I went, oh, that's the idea I want to write, it sort of unlocked almost at that stage, about 37, 38 years at that stage, almost 40 years of sort of this pent up, not frustration or anything like that, or kind of, volcanic eruption of writing or anything, but just this sort of everything that I'd soaked up over the years and everything I'd always wanted to do. And everything I'd loved, and kind of, I just started putting it down on paper.
You mentioned that you had enjoyed fantasy and as a kid, and so I see, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which I know like a lot of young readers are besotted with, or I know a lot of people my age now that loved this book once. And
the amazing thing about this is that even though it's full of jokes about digital watches and planning, kind of applications and immovable council men, and the sort of frustrations of being a repressed English man floating around an uncaring universe, kids still love it now. If you give that book to an 10, 11, 12-year-old, and I know this because I have one of them at home, and he couldn't believe how good that was. When I was, when I was growing up in the 80s, you didn't really have that. Well, we didn't have that huge industry in children's writing that you have now. So now everything is so segmented that you can start it. It's literally, with a book that you eat, and kind of shove in your mouth while you're in the bath at 0 all the way up. And it's as if they have kind of books for every single age and every single reading age, or whatever way you want to put it. But it used to be that you kind of jumped from kids' books to sort of adult books, really. And for me, like a lot of people, I would have jumped into Stephen King as a teenager, and then discovered Douglas Adams. And I can honestly say this book changed my life, because it remains my favourite book. It's a book which I can pick up any page, any line, and still find like it's the first time I've ever read it. And when I came eventually to write Darkmouth, I've never made any sort of bones about it. I wanted to write a story that had the kind of, I was never going to reach Douglas Adams' level, but I wanted to have humour. I wanted to have different worlds. I wanted to have an ability to jump from the main story into some sort of weird side story for a couple of pages. And I put all those. So a lot of the ideas that Douglas Adams had for Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy obviously were just so good, so strong, so amazing. I mean, it's and I kind of, they were imprinted in my brain. So, and the thing about children's writing is that's where you do that now. I mean, there's very little adult fiction or even science fiction that's ever come even remotely close to matching what Douglas Adams did.
It's only when I see this that because I read this years ago, that I realise how short it is. I mean,
it's incredibly short,
very small book, yeah.
And that and The Restaurant at the End of the Universe they're almost perfect books. Uh-huh. They're so good. Now he wrote another 3 after that, and unfortunately they get progressively probably not as good and darker and not as funny. But those first 2 books are astonishing, and sometimes people sort of don't realise. They say, "Oh yeah, I read that when I was younger," but every single line in them is almost perfect. Is this the same book you had when you were younger? No. Just the new I would have picked that up then. Yeah, this kind of would have picked that up. I'm one of those people, I don't know, maybe people are like this. I have books, some books for years, and then I have other books which just have disappeared, between moves and, when you're kind of, stuff that might be floating around my parents' house. And
you lend them to people and the feckers don't give them back.
So I have a few, but this isn't quite, but I rediscovered it probably about sort of 15 years ago then again. So like a lot of things, you sort of read things when you're younger, or you see things, because I would have watched a lot of film and TV, and then you move on and you're kind of doing other things, and then sometimes you make a rediscovery. And I definitely, having loved this book when I was in my early teens and mid-teens, rediscovered it then in my 30s, early 30s, and just couldn't believe how good it still is. And so you can write the kind of stuff that Douglas Adams has written for adults, and which nobody else has really managed in terms of sort of jokes, cliffhangers, ridiculous action, surreal moments, bit of philosophy, a lot of philosophy. You can write that for children.
Yeah.
I don't know if necessarily adults read those kind of books, but children will absorb all of that, and I think that's why Douglas Adams appeals to them so much, because it's really a children's book in some regards.
Okay. Then something slightly different. This is a graphic novel?
Well, it's more representative. Again, I would have had the X-Men.
Right.
So I would have grown up with Marvel Comics.
Okay.
And so when I we're sitting here talking about books, but obviously, like so many writers, I'm influenced by so many different things. And when I was growing up, I was watching a huge amount of television. Later on, it would be films. But and I was reading a lot of comic books, and this confluence of all these kind of different ideas. So I was, I'm a child of Doctor Who, and not just the kind of sort of coloured Doctor Who, but the really old ones, because there was no children's TV back then. So you had a huge amount of 50s and 60s sci-fi films and programs kind of recycled when there was very little children's TV. So I watched all of those, and then at the same time was reading a huge amount of things like the X-Men. And even though I can't write or draw, I can't draw to save my life. I was hugely, just the impact that these comic books had on me, superheroes. So I would have read a lot of kind of things like Daredevil and Spider-Man and all the sort of the Marvel stuff that now has, I think back then felt like, again, it was a kid's thing. It was something which you shared with your friends. You became completely absorbed in these worlds that unraveled over time. So you didn't have, now, as happens, you kind of go in, you buy these collections, but back then you were literally waiting for the next installment to appear on the shelves, which people still do now, but and it was a very different type of reading, but it had in the sense that the stories were years long. And we're very sophisticated, and the art was really sophisticated. But at the centre of it then you had action, and you had colour, and you had superheroes and costumes and all those things that turned out to eventually take over modern culture.
A lot of the Marvel stuff though has changed in that the audience used to be children, but now it's adults, maybe more so even than children.
Well, I mean, I don't think it could have anticipated how much it would end up taking over the world.
Yeah.
You know, the biggest film of all time
Yeah.
is based on not these X-Men characters, but on that kind of Marvel universe.
Yeah.
And you know, with the Avengers, so it's incredible how it has gone from where it was to where it is now. But I can kind of understand it in a way, because what they've done is they've taken that long form storytelling and managed to make a movie franchise out of it. And when I was 11, 12, that's what we were getting back then, but we were getting it in its sort of original graphic form. And these had a big impact on me, because I don't know, I think in terms of stirring the imagination, stirring kind of storytelling, and I tried to mimic it. I came up with my own characters called very originally the Revengers, and tried to draw really bad comic books out of them. But they were the kind of things that I think, you know, I meet young writers now, and I go, you know, I'm lucky enough to go into places like Fighting Words quite a lot, Roddy Doyle's sort of schools or writing teaching classes, and I love when I see kids, you know, have been very clearly in a way inspired by something, and they're kind of trying to make something out of some, you know, with their own voice out of something that they love, because that's in a way how you learn and how you develop your own voice and how you develop as a writer. So, you know, when I very clearly remember having all those X-Men comics and trying to create my own world, kind of, you know, based on what, you know, on those comics. And then again, the joy of it now is, again, I rediscovered a lot of these when I was older through my own son, who absolutely loves them. And I find that people really worry about their 13, 14-year-old who doesn't read.
Yeah.
Because it happens. Kids often stop reading once they get into secondary school, unfortunately. Boys especially kind of drop off a cliff when it comes to their reading. But we've found that the comic books have been the winner in the house, and they keep us going as something that we both kind of read together.
Is that something you feel strongly about, maybe because you're a writer or because you're a reader, that you want your kids to read?
Well, I think, yeah, you do. But I mean, I try and, so I do, and I'm finding that I love giving him things. I suppose at the moment I've got 3 younger girls who are all at an age now where they just love books.
Okay.
And then with my teenager, it's slightly different because he's got so much else on. But I love when he discovers things and when he finds things. There's a kind of a real pleasure in that. And for instance, he's reading Kate DiCamillo at the moment, who's an amazing American writer. And he's at an age now where he can understand why something is good. He can really appreciate elements of the storytelling and the writing and all of that. But at the same time, we have to remember, and this is kind of part of it, you know, when I was growing up, how many times have I said that? But it's true. When I was growing up, you know, we weren't as visual a generation.
Yeah.
Because we didn't have that amount of amazing, you know, kind of films, TV of a very high level. So this is where things like the Marvel comics came in, because they gave us that. In a way, as we know, so much that's come since is based on how sophisticated those comic books were. But now, if you're a kid growing up now, you have some of the greatest kids' TV ever made, some of the greatest kids' films ever made, and some, in the cases of a lot of Pixar, some of the best films ever made. So they're far more visual generation, and I think it's great for them to read, and I want my kids to be reading, but I also have to understand that they're getting great storytelling from Adventure Time, you know, or regular show, or these brilliant cartoons, or they're getting them from the films that they watch as well, and they have access to a world of film and TV that we never had, or I certainly didn't have. And so as long as they're enjoying stories, and they're kind of they're in, I suppose, they're not just using their imagination, but they're allowing their imagination to step into other people's heads and experience other points of view. Yeah. Then sometimes we can feel it has to be through a book. Yeah. But you know, there can be great stuff through the screen as well.
Okay, so Philip Pullman, Northern Lights. Tell me why you picked this.
So as I, I'm not the Harry Potter generation, right? Very clear. So I'm 45 now. So I'm not. I was of an age when Harry Potter came out. It sort of, I wasn't reading children's books.
Okay.
Because I was probably kind of in my late 20s around then, mid-20s certainly. Yeah. Because what is it, 20 years, just over 20 years now. But, and 20, the truth is that if you were 25-year-old, man in Dublin, you weren't going in and picking up Harry Potter.
Book. No,
it wasn't really. Yeah. So, in some ways that revolution in children's books was something which I was kind of like observing rather than experiencing.
Yeah.
And it was really when I started then to read, there were a few books around the time when I realised, actually, children's books is at a whole other level to where it was when I was younger. And actually, if I'm going to write, I can see how I could write for children. And there were the things like Owen Colfer's Artemis Fowl, which are just brilliant books. Derek Landy's Skullduggery Pleasant. And they were books that were really important because you could have Irish characters and Irish settings, and they were Irish writers, and that was something again that felt new, that you could write an Irish story and it would be successful internationally. But I think it was when I read his Dark Materials, the Philip Pullman trilogy, that I realised just how sophisticated writing for young readers, because I don't think it's not necessarily a children's book, it's really a young adult book, and I absolutely loved these books. And, they're written for they were originally written maybe for younger readers, but really they're for anybody. And the ideas in them, so, the stories of a parallel world, and then this link between different worlds and characters from different worlds meeting up, all wrapped in this massive, not just a kind of a big story arc, but also a very deep-rooted examination of theology. It struck me as just so much more than I had experienced when I was reading kind of, books as a young adult myself. And I loved those books. And I remember, reading kind of the three of them just back to back, which I hadn't done in a long time, where I just grabbed one book and I was like, I need to know what's happening next.
And you read those in your 20s?
I would have been, at this stage, I probably would have even been kind of hitting around sort of 30, early 30s.
Yeah.
And I just absolutely absorbed in them. And I think that was when I realised that it was around that time, and as I said, it wasn't just with Philip Pullman, but it was when I was starting to discover a lot of the really strong children's and young adult writing, that I realised that you can write, and this is something that people say to me quite a lot, because even in my new book, Boot, which is about a lost robot, you can throw big themes into children's writing.
Yeah.
And often it's about how you write it and the language that you use and kind of how you deliver it, with jokes and cliffhangers and kind of crazy characters and all that. But you can still, I think people are often surprised when they start reading children's writing at first at how big a lot of the themes are and the ideas. And now they're not all approaching it in the way of Philip Pullman, but it was just, for me, it was the moment where I realised you can write really interesting, really sophisticated writing, and it's about the delivery, but because there is an audience, there's a readership for it, and they will get it, and they might understand it on their own level, and I think that, but they will understand it in some way, and it will connect with them. And while I didn't end up writing, maybe, the stuff I was writing was younger, and I'm not in any way saying that I was kind of reaching for Philip Pullman levels.
Okay, yeah.
I really, really wasn't. But it just again, it gave me confidence when I started writing that you can write stuff that's really ambitious in its own way, and which is going to kind of take the story in quite big directions, and that if you do it right, there's a readership for it. Okay,
and the last book, which I think is the only, definitely an adult novel, and no
about
it.
Yeah, so the last one is Anthony Lane is actually the New Yorker film critic.
Yes.
And Nobody's Perfect was his collection of writing from the New Yorker, which came out, I'm not sure exactly when it came, when did it come out? 2002. And around that time, the reason I've picked this is because, I've read a lot of non-fiction over the years, and I love history books, I love science books. I kind of love anything that just gives me something, a new perspective. But when I was starting out in journalism, I got myself a gig in the Irish Times, and it was around then that I kind of discovered Anthony Lane. And again, I think journalism, you've got to have your own voice. The best writers in journalism have their own voice, but you are still sort of, there's foundations underneath that. And I think just around the time that I was looking for exactly how I did love TV and I love film, and I was doing kind of different reviews, but just around the time there was an opportunity to do the TV review for the Irish Times, it was probably even before that, I discovered Anthony Lane, and I just found this voice. His writing is exceptional. His ability to critique a subject in an entertaining way, but while giving you a complete insight into why he feels this works or doesn't work. His ability sometimes just to write about other topics. It reminds me of Clive James, who's another writer who I absolutely adore. And again, as a critic, that they're just taking criticism to a whole new level, which you can. I always feel the sign of a great critic is when you can read them, piece about something that you're never going to see.
Yes, I agree. You're never going to watch it.
And yet it will be the
but
most entertaining piece you've read that day or that week or that month. And Anthony Lane encapsulates that perfectly. So I think again, in that little bit of just giving me, just kind of finding my own voice. And
how long did you do that? Did you do the TV reviews for?
I can't remember exactly. I think I probably did it for about sort of 4 years or something like that. It was one of those. It was a really important. It's weird. That gig was kind of a big gig. Yeah, and it was on the back page of the Irish Times Weekend Review, and I was maybe I was about 26, 27 or something when I got it. So I was full of confidence and arrogance, and felt that my opinion was really, really valid. I've actually got very soft now. I think I find it very difficult to be a critic because I know how hard it is to make something. So I think I've got to a stage now where I don't think I could do that. At that stage I wasn't, I was basing it purely on what I was seeing. But it had a huge impact on me in terms of my career and my ability to kind of week after week sort of create that voice that I was looking for, and to find that confidence, and to have a readership for it, and to be kind of given the opportunity to do it at the time, and to ape, as I said, to finding my voice through kind of the springboard of people like Anthony Lane, whose book I absolutely just, I would have read over and over and over again. A huge amount of my life has been spent looking at the mechanics of how things work, how a sentence works, how a paragraph works, how an article or a story, a short story or a novel or anything works. And that's generally, that's where, people like Douglas Adams, Anthony Lane, Clive James, these, I'm reading them. And on the one hand, you're reading it for the entertainment and to learn something. And on the other hand, there's a bit of you that's pulling it apart and going, how does this work? And if this works, how do I make it work for me? Yeah.
Okay. That's a great point to finish on then. So thank you very much, Shane.
No problem.
And that's all for this episode. Thank you very much for watching.